But this is where the heart of the conversation is like, it's one thing for you to say, we want to influence culture. It might be time well spent to think about helping the church focus on being influenced itself to be, at least consistent and have some degree of integrity and continuity in what it's teaching about the use of our physical bodies and what we believe to be ultimately true.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Amy Grant. She's back in the headlines here.
Forgot about Amy Grant, to be honest.
Well, I'm curious, was she a fixture in your household growing up, Nathan?
So I'm pretty sure that my mom had an Amy Grant Christmas record. We had a record player when I was a little kid. Yep. So the record player would come out around Christmas time, and I'm pretty sure there was an Amy Grant record. So that was the extent of it. If she had a Christmas record album, we had it. That's what I remember. So this is like, we're now talking though, like more than 20 years ago. So,
Well, so this was a staple of my childhood growing up. I remember listening to her on car rides to different speaking meetings that my dad had around Europe because we lived in Austria at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I may even have had a modest little crush on Amy Grant back in those days. Always thought she had a beautiful voice. She's got a lower register. I like that. We had the Christmas album. I still like that Christmas album, probably more just because of nostalgia. But yeah, she was definitely a staple in our household. But she's in the headlines right now. And many of you may not be aware of this, but she and her husband, Vince Gill, are hosting a gay wedding at their ranch. And the wedding is for Amy Grant's niece. So this is obviously very controversial for a certain small segment of evangelicals. Franklin Graham was, surprisingly, he was outspoken on the matter. But I think the reason it's interesting is it brings a number of tensions to the forefront that we're increasingly going to be dealing with. It has to do with, so for a while, I think the conversation surrounding so-called gay marriage, and I'm going to state for the record, this is going to be a point that may be repugnant to some of our listeners for certain, but I think Nathan and I would both be in agreement here. I think gay marriage is actually an oxymoron.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
I can use the phrase and, because it's a legally designated term, but beyond a legal designation, I don't think it actually means it. I don't think it points to anything meaningful.
So and that's just clarify. But you're speaking as a Christian where marriage is a religious concept rather than a legal definition. So yeah, I think if you just put it out there as like, this is what this is and this is what we're talking about, then that makes sense to be consistent using it in that way.
Okay. Yes. So I think a big conversation for many of us who are Christians who hold to a traditional view of marriage was, do I attend a gay, a quote gay wedding?
Mm-hmm.
And is my attendance tantamount to endorsement? And I think that is a complex question, and I think it's going to. I'm just going to go ahead and say there's going to be a spectrum of responses to that. I think it's going to vary depending on the situation. This is again because Cameron McAllister's perspective here. I think it's going to vary depending on the people you're involved with, whether it's understood, where you stand, some of those considerations. But this, to my mind, Nathan, goes a step further. It's one thing to attend. There's a degree of passivity to that. It's another thing to host a wedding on your property. So that looks like we're approaching closer to an endorsement here, I think, or some. It's very difficult to my mind not to see that as an act of affirmation, and so I think that's and also Amy Grant's status as a Christian celebrity or former Christian celebrity, depending on how you look at this, plays a role here as well.
Yeah, so part of okay, so this requires some introspection here, because I'm trying to decide why I don't think it's as so on one hand, I would say like why I think it is a really big deal, and on the other hand, it's not really a big deal. And so for me, I would say, kind of where I try to faithfully make my distinctions is that it isn't a case by case thing. That it's easier to have like this is the type of wedding that I participate in and attend, and these other ones are not marriages, and my presence there is not helpful to anybody. Um, so because then you get into some really interesting like hair splitting of justifying situations over others. But so am I surprised that a celebrity in this time would host a marriage that, 20 years ago they wouldn't have? No, not at all. Um, or host a wedding, I guess I would say. So is that a sign of just like my general cynicism of like
No,
this
I don't.
backbone of Christian celebrity? Or and because you get down to like, so you sent me an article on it, I looked over and she's like, well, God said love him and love each other, that's pretty simple, so everything's included in that. It's just like, okay, that seems to be about exactly where I think most people are now. Our church would say love God, love people, absolutely. And but we would also not fall into we would probably use welcoming and um we wouldn't say we're open and affirming. I think we're welcoming and faithful. But the balance there, like the whole conversation just seems to be in an echelon of my reality that is watered down to the degree that I don't get too excited about it. And maybe that's something wrong with me, that I should be more wound up about it. But I think it has more to do with just like, man, it's about what I would expect without approving it or affirming it at all. Just to be like, yeah, help me out there. What's wrong with me?
Well, I think neither you nor I are inclined to put too much stock into somebody who is a quote celebrity as a figure of spiritual authority.
Yeah, once you're a
I think
celebrity, Cameron, I'm not going to listen to you anymore.
well, I would draw
No, not
yeah,
quite.
I would draw a sharp distinction between cultural influence and spiritual authority. But
Yes,
that line is
absolutely.
blurred for I think for a lot of people. And in the past, this is why I do believe this issue is important, because I think a lot of particularly evangelical Christians are still working through the shortcomings of a model that was very predicated on cultural influence being a huge and unquestioned good. It's not always a good. It actually is it's quite a mixed bag. And actually the elephant in the room when we're talking about Amy Grant would also be her marriage to Vince Gill in the first place. I don't know if you recall the circumstances of that, Nathan.
Nope. Just assume
You
I
haven't
know
followed
nothing.
this. So Vince Gill is Amy Grant's second marriage. And when this
Okay.
happened, this was a big deal in its own right, to the point where there were jokes being made about it at the MTV Music Awards. So at the time when
How
this
long
was
ago are
taking
we
place,
talking here? What's the time
oh
frame?
my goodness, this would have been the 1990s. I don't remember the precise date. Let's say around 92, something like that.
Okay.
Right around the So this occurred around the time when Amy Grant was making the transition from being a quote Christian artist to just a full-fledged pop singer. And songs like I Second That Emotion, which was, a roller skating rink anthem. I know this I have this on good authority from my wife who used to roller skate to that song. But so at the MTV Music Awards, certainly not a place where you're used to hearing about Christian celebrity gossip. There was a joke being made because REM had a song out at the time. Probably to this day, REM is most recognized for two songs. It's The End of the World as We Know It, and the other one is Losing My Religion. And the joke was made about Amy Grant losing her religion. But this was a big deal. I bring that up just because, and I'm just going to submit this for consideration. One of the really, I think, convicting and painful points that Carl Truman makes in his immensely popular book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That's a surprising bestseller. I don't think anybody expected that book to fly off the shelves the way it has. It's a really helpful book, by the way, and I would recommend it. And Carl Trueman doesn't mince words, but one of the things that he says as he's meditating on the change in sexual ethics was that he singles out Ronald Reagan's no-fault divorce law as a huge shift in the way we approach the sanctity of marriage, and he didn't see it as a move in the right direction. So I'm just going to leave that there.
Okay, yeah. So hang on, I'll bite on that. Why? But again, so that okay, maybe that's true, and it is a cultural turning point. However, if marriage is a religious category, then what the president thinks probably shouldn't factor into how Christian people understand it and live within it. So
You're right,
for me, there's
but
a little bit of a again.
yeah, you're right, but that's idealistic in the sense that it practically does factor in hugely for many people. Because when it becomes a matter of legal policy, then it is touching on the day-to-day circumstances of people's lives, and it becomes part and parcel of what they're doing. You're right. It ought not to be. And none of this, of course, none of these cultural convulsions change the actual ontological status, sorry to get all highfalutin there, of marriage as defined by its author.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But they do monkey with the human perception.
Yeah, so all right, but this will also come across as a theological and denominational issue as well. So let me give you a little story here. So even back in like 2014, 2016, and there when I was running around up in New England, you had a lot of churches in like Vermont, New Hampshire, who had at that time what were considered more progressive marriage laws. And you had a bunch of, shall we say, more conservative churches who stopped doing weddings. And when I say they stopped doing weddings, what that meant is they didn't do any weddings. They did do religious marriages. And so if you came to them and said, "I would like to would you do a wedding for me?" They'd say, "No. But we'll do a marriage for you if you're a Christian because this is a church." And so what would happen is you would come to them if you want to get married. They might go with you to the courthouse. You would go down. The justice of the peace would legally marry you. You sealed in your tax status because functionally that's what marriage is now. And then you went to the church for a religious ceremony of forming covenants between God and with each other. And then that got them off the hook of being able to say no to certain types of like, well, this church doesn't do gay weddings. Well, actually, we don't do any weddings. We do religious marital services for our congregants. And most of the world functions that way, to be honest. However, in a certain brand of theology that was more, has a little interest in the legal system and Christian influence of it, they saw that as a massive step in the wrong direction of Christians losing their voice and not fighting that battle. And this is a moral travesty for the cultural element and all that. So I'm saying that to say that I think some of the things that some segments of the church, even in North America, are dealing with, there are other elements of the church in North America who are about 10 years ahead of everybody else on how this will practically and functionally work itself out. So that's not necessarily good or bad. I just want to point that out there as an interesting thing I think by and large, there's a trend to separate out and practically cede whatever the government wants to decide. The government can decide, but we as a church are going to do things this way. Now, I set all of that up as a counter argument to myself against saying the Reagan thing wasn't a big deal because obviously when the laws change, then people by and large follow suit. But that is more of a problem, I think, with the authority and the clarity with which the church can teach what marriage actually is, rather than the way culture actually changes. So yeah, there's a little rabbit trail.
No, it is. And we're dealing with a crisis of authority here. And I think if we're now circling back to Amy Grant, if we had a model previously that was largely unquestioned and unexamined, that cultural influence was a necessary good and desirable, then you're going to move in a certain direction that's going to bring you in lockstep with culture. That's kind of inevitable. But that, I think we can all see now, is clearly not going to be the future for the church in North America. And it really shouldn't have been where the church was placing most of her hopes to begin with. Now, I
Mhm.
also want to say there's nothing wrong with cultural influence per se. Having a positive impact on your community and on your culture can be a wonderful thing. Of course it can. And you can point to historic examples of that. But we're coming back to this again and again. We talked about this in the winsomeness is not a strategy episode, but you have to be willing to be reviled as well.
Okay.
Amy Grant's quote about so Amy Grant's quote that you singled out there, where she said, basically I'll get it. I won't get it precisely the way she said it, but Jesus's marching orders to us or command to us are pretty simple: love God and love people. That the way she's interpreting that with her actions is an iteration of, well, I believe Jesus is my Lord and Savior, but that's just my personal opinion. The reason it's an iteration of that,
Well,
and
and
by
that
the way,
love has no boundaries or actual definition rooted in anything other than what we think
well,
it is.
right, and the reason that's a silly sentiment, and so maybe that doesn't sound so. Maybe that sounds somewhat sensible to you. I believe in Jesus Christ, but that's just my personal opinion. People continue to say that. By the way, I saw a tweet saying that not too long ago from a celebrity. So the reason that's silly is because just pause for a second and think: if Christ is in fact Lord of all, it cannot just be your personal opinion, and it cannot mean that his rulership is strictly private or restricted only to human hearts, and it has no public implications. It
The Earth
has to
has
have
one
public
moon, but that's just
ramifications.
my personal opinion.
Right. It's about tantamount to a statement like that. But again, what we're pushing into is we're coming to a historical juncture where you're really going to have to face the fact: do you actually believe this or not?
Well, okay,
Or
so
is it, yeah,
but this is my thing. So I guess you're coming at this from Vienna to Georgia, saying the juncture is coming, and I'm coming like geographically in the other direction, saying I think the juncture has already like we passed that intersection already. So here's the way that I want to let's use this as a test case. Do you know any popular musicians, Christian or no, who are actual celebrities and hold to a traditional Christian sexual ethic and definition of marriage?
it's a good question.
And so I'm
And
saying, can you be a
yeah,
celebrity today and have an opinion other than what Amy Grant has?
certainly the rules of inclusion seem to require a certain answer to that question, don't they? Yeah.
Well,
And I think the point's well taken.
I'm not trying to make a point. I'm trying to sort things out for myself here. So, hey, any listeners who are listening in, send me an email and explain me to myself. That'd be great. I think that am I saying that in order to be a celebrity, you kind of have to fit like the greatest common denominator factor or the lowest common denominator factor in order to be a celebrity? Like is because it seems like there's such a high demand of conformity in some categories that you can't like the system is rigged isn't the right word, but it's a sign that we've passed the juncture where there are categories in which debate on this would exclude you from being a celebrity.
I like where you're going. Let me phrase the matter somewhat differently to
Please
make the
help.
same point you are. If we are entering into an increasingly post-Christian moment, and I would say by and large in our culture, if we're talking about our cultural elites in those sectors, we are fully post-Christian, then what would it mean? What would your credentials need to look like to be, quote, really popular in a fully post-Christian moment?
Dun dun dun.
They got to look you got to look post-Christian, right? You have to, I mean, because popularity is necessarily going to be predicated on a certain type of uniformity with the
So
cultural
silence and
assumptions.
camouflage. There have to be people out there who do, but I'm going to say that it's a very quiet, well camouflaged opinion and perspective.
But putting the matter as you just have, and the way, and as I just had, we've phrased for you a pretty little dilemma that we're now facing as Christians. Well, it's only a dilemma if your if your view of cultural if you view cultural influence as something that is completely good or
Well, okay.
desirable, or that's the necessary goal.
Okay, well, I'm trying to think if we wanna say it that way or if we wanna so cultural influence is good, but is not the primary goal. How about that?
Yeah, or we change our view of what influence looks like and our expectations of it.
But see,
I
immediately,
think
people are gonna push back and say, "Nathan and Cameron, you guys aren't fighting the culture war. You're ceding ground to culture, and it's a form of quietism, and innocent people are gonna get hurt." What's the response?
eh, my response is, if the way that if we continue doing what we've been doing by and large, then the only way to reach people on that level, to gain that kind of popular cultural influence, is to either downplay certain unpalatable elements of the gospel and Christianity,
So don't be distinct.
or yes, don't be distinct, water it way down. We've seen, by the way, we've seen that in the past. We're seeing the fruits of that right now. Or essentially embrace a more progressive script. And we're seeing that too. And
Yeah,
move
just
in the
change your
way of a
theology to fit
mainline,
culture.
change your theology to fit culture. And again, there's nothing new about either of these maneuvers. There's a long a long history of this. You can just look into you can look into the history books and see Christians going in these directions, especially in points of cultural crisis. So influence can happen, but I think the influence is going to look more like a willingness to be reviled, a willingness to have uncomfortable, awkward conversations, a willingness to be marginalized. And again, that's not actively seeking to be obnoxious or antagonistic. Nothing of the sort. But this is again in the sense in which winsomeness is not going to be a strategy. We have to be willing to hold fast to Christ and his church and his kingdom rather than the cultural mores surrounding us. It's always been like this, but when you reach a point where Christianity is viewed as with a high level of suspicion at the very best and downright hostility at the worst, you've got to be willing to be hated. And that, I think that's where we're at right now. And that's why I think these cases are really interesting. Framing them in terms of, I think we could go down a fruitful trail talking about what love actually entails as well here, because I do think Amy Grant the sentiments that she expressed they're going to sound, they fit within the plausibility structure of our culture right now. So I think they will sound sensible to a lot of people. So I think it's worth exploring why you and I both would find them to be misguided as well.
Okay,
But
so, all right, let's do this then. Let's go there. I was thinking
let's go
about
there.
this. Help me out on this one. So, the formation of almost every major world religion comes with a specific sexual ethic. So, you have, from Genesis 1, let's look at Judaism. Adam and
Hmm.
Eve in the garden, you have an outline there for procreation and relationship,
Hmm.
man and woman, create image of God. You have Muhammad has a revelation, 9 wives for him, 4 for everybody else, or just 4 at a time. Um, Brigham Young, Joseph Smith, Mormonism, different sexual paradigm. Hinduism, you have all of the original yoga sexualization stuff going on there. That's, you know, the Westerners have deleted some of that part out of it, perhaps, but a very real thing. Jesus shows up with a recalibration and the ability to live a fully human life, celibate.
Hmm.
You have it's just like sex and religion are such a big deal. The point I'm making is it goes across why. So part of it is like if religion touches every part of your life, it makes sense that religious paradigm shifts come with sexual paradigm shifts as well. I
Right.
mean, does that that seems to
Yes.
make sense. So, but what like it seems like we're living in a time in which we're trying to disconnect sexuality and embodiment from what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And it's kind of like saying, I'd love to take the engine and tires off of my car and still drive it over to visit you. Like for most people, those are pieces that can come apart and still be functional. But if that's true, then that means you had a very low view of the original vehicle, to use the analogy there. So there's something going on here that like for a lot of people are like, whatever. And for most people, you're like, that doesn't this does because you use the sentence at the beginning like gay marriage is an oxymoron. Like it doesn't make sense because it
Mhm.
doesn't point to anything meaningful. Well, that deeply assumes that marriage is supposed to point to something at all rather than a
Yes.
tax status. So
Yep.
this is where the culture for me, this is where the battle, quote, using battle here loosely, because I'm not really a culture warring kind of person, but this is where the heart of the conversation is like, it's one thing for you to say, we want to influence culture. It might be time well spent to think about helping the church focus on being influenced itself to be, at least consistent and have some degree of integrity and continuity in what it's teaching
Mhm.
about the use of our physical bodies and what we believe to be ultimately true. So, how's that fit?
Well, your use of a vehicle, a car, is really telling because a car has a clear purpose and design. It has a telos, you might say. And Alice, I mean, again, I'll bring in a dusty philosopher here because dusty philosophers are really helpful and actually really practical, contrary to what everybody thinks. So, Alistair McIntyre, in his wonderful book After Virtue, points out that one of the central problems with our world today is that we cannot agree on what human beings are for. We
Sure.
can't
Yeah.
agree on the fact that human beings have a design, have a purpose, and have a destiny. Now, Christians do. So, for a Christian, a person is a lot closer to a car, not in the materialistic reductive sense, but in the sense that the car actually has a function and a purpose and a maker and a design. And if you remove the wheels and try to drive it, that's a fool's errand. So, similarly, if a person is made by God for God, and all of the functions of a person are made by God for his glorification and for, including functions of intimacy, then that points again to the fact that they have an author. So there is a design, there's a telos, and there is a purpose there. And again, on a Christian view of reality, it may be now culturally that doesn't fit in. That may seem disgusting or vile or pernicious, but it makes sense. It really does make sense. And I think what we're confronting right now, the central question these days, Nathan, is not what do Christians believe necessarily, defend your beliefs and the content of your beliefs. It's really what do Christians do? That it starts with the actual actions of Christian men and women in this
Yeah,
cultural moment.
yeah, but that's bad because that means that we have passed the juncture beyond which beliefs and actions would be seen to be the same thing. So you can
Mhm.
believe whatever you
Yep,
want as long as it doesn't bother me. Is a statement that assumes that your beliefs don't actually practically express themselves.
it is. And in the past, let's just face it, Nathan, people's beliefs interfered with their actual lives on a fairly inconsistent basis. you know, people will tell you they believe all sorts of things, and we know this in everyday life. We believe all sorts of things about what we should be doing, diet wise, exercise wise, social media wise, television wise, with our free time, and our actions spell out a very different story. But if see, that's why it may be I said in cultural terms, people want to know what Christians actually do. But the question for us as Christians now is, do I actually believe this? Do I believe this in the sense that I'm going to actually follow Jesus and live my life on the basis of his mandate and his commands rather than what I want to do? Because a lot of Christians or so-called Christians are discovering that when it comes to sexual ethics or essentially what, culturally permissible activities, they essentially want to do what they want to do.
Yeah. So the
And
question. So can I reframe your question though? So the question is,
yeah,
am
please
I
do.
willing to believe this if it hurts?
That's right.
But it goes both ways
Yeah.
because one is if it's inconvenient to me, but then particularly in a culture where disagreement is hatred, if I believe something that is inherent that I'm told is inherently harmful to somebody who sees it in another way, there's a twofold, there's the personal difficulty, but then there's also the socially constructed difficulty of holding a belief. So that, I think, has more to do maybe with the phenomenon of Christian deconstruction, as you've called it, which is actually just Christian maturity, perhaps. Um,
Hmm.
that fits in there in my mind.
Yeah, and I mean, coming to a place where we are willing to confront the fact that Christianity requires sacrifice from all of this. I've always appreciated how Sam Albury frames this when people because Sam Albury has done a lot of speaking and a lot of writing on the topic of sexual orientation given his own story.
And
People
celibacy,
often
yeah.
say right, and people often will say to him, "Well, this is must be so difficult for you. I mean, it's a very high sacrifice for you." And Sam's response is essentially, well, all of us, I mean, Christianity requires sacrifice from all of us. And if your faith requires no sacrifice from you, perhaps time to examine your heart. And I mean, we've simply entered a cultural juncture where that is becoming unavoidable. Now, that's always been the case, but there are times where when the adversity increases. So that's why I think that what's happening right now on a cultural level, on the one hand, is lamentable. There is a real sense of loss, but we can also see that it's in some ways this is helpful. This is a kind of tonic for us because it's a cold shower, it's a sobering up, however you want to phrase it. It's an awakening moment to see where one's actual allegiances lie. Are they with Christ or are they going to be with, cultural orthodoxy? And I think I mean, it's perhaps maybe it's not that stark, but I think it is getting to be quite stark. And I think we have to come to a place where we either confess Christ as Lord in word and in deed, or we do what we want to do.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think through the idea, though, that if you think that sexual freedom is the highest good, heaven would be a miserable place because Christianity uniquely
Yes,
holds a non sexual eternity where it's
that's right.
not the highest good. And so that's just a, if you're thinking comparatively about what you believe, if you're a Christian listening to this and what a lot of other people believe, we're talking about intimacy, satisfaction, and commitment and relational beauty that transcends our sexuality. Not that it's bad now, but it isn't ultimate.
Sure.
Um, and so the idea of a sexless eternity um, would not be good news to a lot of people, given what it seems like we've culturally geared ourselves to claiming is the best.
And that's perhaps a whole nother episode because I think for many in the modern world, sex became kind of the last major source of transcendence for a lot of people. But the fact remains, everything you've just said is true, and also the the most full example of perfection in humanity, Christ, was himself celibate. And
Yeah.
again, let's bring in Sam Albury again. He puts this so well. If sexuality is necessary for the full expression of humanity, then you're calling my Lord subhuman. And that's something that needs to be wrestled with
Well,
in
look at
in our
that.
moment as well.
This is
Yeah.
where we've gotten by starting by talking about Amy Grant. So,
Yeah.
what have we learned? Summarize this, wrap this up for me, because on one hand, I'm about where I started. I think some of it, I'm not happy with where I am in the sense that I think that I'm a bit cynical, and this is the kind of thing I expect. But by feeling that, I'm I'm embracing the mindset that we've passed a juncture in which really, truly, culturally transformative Christian celebrities exist. Um, and so I'm
Yeah.
trying to decide if I'm wrong or if I'm just slow and I'm lamenting the realization of the world that I live in.
Well, I'll just say I don't think you're wrong, but I do think this is an instructive example of a deficiency of a certain view of cultural influence, which is why I think it was worth talking about. And also, the sentiments expressed by Amy Grant, I think a lot of people will still find inherently plausible given the atmosphere of our culture. And because of that, I think it's worth spelling out precisely why that is not the case. And my hope is that we, as a church, continue to move past this and that we're able to settle into the discomfort of our cultural moment. And increasingly on my heart, Nathan, is, and this is perhaps a theme for a different podcast. I'll close here. But instead of, we've talked about this, instead of the notion of, okay, the cultural moment is getting more difficult. It's harder, it's darker. Instead of looking at just mere survival, how are we going to get through this? Focusing on how we flourish in this moment and how we actually thrive. Because the church has, down the ages, and all sorts of cultural adversity.
But it also means that the feel of going to church will be much richer because it'll be more distinct. That's what you have to look forward to in the future here. So, yeah, I'm not doom and gloom about it at all.
I'm positive about it.
Yeah, but, trying to understand the times.
Embrace your weirdness. Lean into it because we've talked about that before. I mean,
it's good Peter training for what's coming.
That's right. He didn't call you a resident alien for nothing. So let's recognize that if you walk about as a citizen of heaven in what is effectively Babylon, that's going to be your experience. So
this is such a classic Thinking Out Loud episode where I think probably what we should have talked about was something that said, "Hey, I hope you guys had a Merry Christmas," which I hope you did, but we've blown right past that one and on to something else. So either we're sorry or you're welcome.
But it doesn't get much more thinking out loud than this. We wish you a retroactive Merry Christmas.
Oh yeah. Everyone interested in time travel, meet here last Tuesday. Anyway. All right. We digress. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.